Good morning. Welcome to our Conversations program. My name is Emily Butler. I'm the Conversations curator here at Art Basel. We're really honored to be welcoming 4 artists who will consider the meaning of connectivity today, the ecological and social impact of technology, and the carbon footprint of our devices. I'm delighted that artists Agnieszka Kurant, Joshua Citarella, João Enxuto, and Erika Love are here today. And the panel will be moderated by expert Michaela Bailey, who's the co-executive director at Rhizome at the New Museum in New York. I wanted to also thank the ICA and Jean Moreno, with whom we've collaborated to organize this panel today. The conversation will last approximately 50 minutes. We've got 10 minutes of questions at the end. We'll be passing a mic around, so feel free to put your hand up to ask any questions. And please do join me in giving our speakers today a very warm round of applause and enjoy the conversation.
Hello, my name is Michaela Bailey. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to do just brief introductions of everyone on the panel. And so if we could advance to the next slide, please. All right, so we're gonna start with Josh. Oh, here, I'll pass that to Josh as well.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for coming. My name is Joshua Citarella. I'm an artist and an internet culture researcher. We're looking at a piece here which is a doomsday prepper in a micro apartment in Chinatown in New York, where the city has been flooded up to the 1.5 floor and people commute through canoes and drones and Uber choppers. This work in particular is more or less an itemized list of communities that collect on platforms such as Reddit, Discord, 4chan, Instagram, all over, libertarians, doomsday preppers, anarcho-capitalists, and this is forecasting this future in about, let's say, 5 to 10 years' time. Following slide is called, this is a 16-foot piece. These are life-size tableaus constructed of, let's say, 250 images painstakingly pieced together through Photoshop to create a hyper-realistic version of the future that these communities expect to unfold. This one in particular is called Bioweapon Defense Mode, which is not a joke. It's a real feature built into your Tesla. If you go to the touchscreen panel, you can engage an HEPA, a HEPA filter that's built by a military subcontractor. It was initially floated as a bit of hyperbole or exaggeration, and then in 2015 it was tested, and you can literally, no exaggeration, survive a military-grade bioweapon by staying inside your car. I've spent the last few years researching social media, and I think a group that we'll probably talk about later in this panel in relation to climate change, connectivity, and radical politics on the internet is the post-left, which is a group of Luddites, anarcho-primitivists, eco-extremists, and I've spent the last few years studying emergent political movements on social media as a type of political trend casting, political forecasting. This research is encapsulated in a book that I first published in 2018, Politogram in the Post-Left. The final version was released in 2021, which is a long story between the 2 periods of publishing the book that involves a lot of feedback from the people, the young accounts that are featured in this book. Most of the kids, when this research began, were between the ages of 12 and 17. This is a post from one of them in 2018. The age since then has drifted up to, let's say, 15 to 22, but you're watching an onset of rapid political extremism taking place over social media. To give you a sense of some of these accounts, these are screenshots that have since been anonymized, but extremely individuated, detailed pouring over of histories, some of them fictional, some of them little known. And there's a strange type of like niche emergent behavior where people participate in the dynamics of Web 2 social media to stake out a political identity as a type of personal brand. This series is called Etiologies, and I think we will talk about some of these micro-communities later on. But what you start to see in this process is that people are no longer satisfied with staking out the commonplace political positions and then increasingly nicheify to the extent where they begin to make up new political ideologies like anarcho-primitivist caliphatism, libertarian neo-monarchism, Catholic distributist transhumanism, and so on and so forth, and many more. So this has been an ongoing series. I think there are now 3. I'm working on a 4th one of them. And ideology is the term that I've picked up from these communities as they used to describe it, E as in email instead of ideology, which is this pairing of prefixes and suffixes to generate new political labels. And this is the thesis statement from Politigram in the post-left, which I'll probably recap a bit later.
Hello, good morning. My name is Agnieszka Kurant. I'm a visual artist. And my work centers on the phenomenon of collective intelligence and how everything that we create as societies is a product of a multitude, labor of the multitude, collective intelligence. But actually everything that happens in nature is also a result of an emergence from a collective intelligence of molecules, little organisms, or various other phenomena. And so this is a series of works entitled AAI, which stands for Artificial Intelligence. That is a cynical phrase coined by Jeff Bezos to describe the work performed online by millions of people that are simulating the work of an algorithm on this crowdsourcing platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk. So this is a series of works that I crowdsourced to termite colonies. So each sculpture is built by 1 million or a couple million of living termites. It takes about 3-4 months to build. Each form is different, and then we can say something about each of the colony looking at the shape of the sculpture, and entomologists are able to say how this collective personalities evolve. And so I started this process of outsourcing, and what I gave the termites are almost blind, and so I gave them gold, broken crystals, and very vividly pigmented sand, and they didn't notice, and so they built this completely artificial synthetic forms, hovering somewhere between culture and nature. This is a series of works, The End of Signature, which I realized on multiple buildings and also indoors. In each case, I work with computer programmers to use AI to fuse together thousands of or tens of thousands of signatures of a given community or a social movement or a group of people supporting one cause. So in this case, on the facade of the Guggenheim Museum, we fused together signatures of all the people visiting the museum, because I noticed how in contemporary economy, since we're posting a lot of images online, images of artworks, and this posting contributes to the creation of value of artworks. But I've also done recently this project at MIT LIST and at the MIT Kendall Square. It's a permanent public commission where together with computer scientists at MIT, I created collective signatures of all the scientists and academics that ever worked at MIT from the beginning till now. And MIT stores the signatures of everybody that worked there. And so we created this kind of collective intelligence, collective signature, and maybe we'll be able to talk about this a bit more later. And the signature is in motion. It's always changing, because I'm interested in this kind of forms of technology that are evolving and become living fossils, no longer in use over time, such as handwriting. This is a series of conversions, which are paintings that evolve like living organisms. Each painting is connected to an animation that we scrape Twitter and Reddit and Instagram posts in different opinion dynamics and shifting changes of mood among members of protest movements around the world. And this influences actual changes, physical changes of the painting, of the molecules of the paint, because the paintings are executed with special paint, which is a liquid crystal paint, and liquid crystals can evolve when there some electrical charge or temperature change is delivered to them. So this is the same painting a few minutes later and a few minutes later. And this is a project I did recently at MIT and was exhibited in Venice this summer, where it's a 75-year-old bonsai tree that is entangled with the prediction of how this species is going to evolve in the future. So also working with scientists at MIT, we fused together thousands of photographs of real bonsai juniper trees, and this is how actually we can predict how that certain optimization of this species can happen. So AI essentially optimizes forms in a similar way to the way that nature does. And these two forms are entangled together, so this 75-year-old form is entangled with its own future. This is a project related to connections between digital capitalism and geology. So all the forms in this aquarium are emerging from molecules of metal salts that I place in a solution of sodium silicate. These are metal salts that are salts of metals that are present in computers and server farms, but when they are placed within this sodium silicate, they start growing into this beautiful plant-like forms. And they look like this and like this. And as it turns out, at the beginning of life, there were the same metals present in the oceans as are currently destroying, the extraction of which is destroying our ecosystems. So these forms are growing, but they are preceding life. These forms at the bottom of the ocean were preceding life. These are some amalgamations of labor done in a more analog way on production, like at factories, production lines of car factories. And so it turns out that over 100 years of car manufacturing, there were particles of paint floating in the air at factories, and they were accumulating on the production lines and fossilizing into these agate stone quasi-geological formations. So when all these factories in Detroit and other cities closed, the workers started circulating these geological formations because they can be used to make jewelry. And I buy these forms from former workers and create these new forms. This is the NFT, expanded NFT project that I recently realized with the platform Zine. And this is called Sentimentite, and it's a digital NFT together with a physical sculpture, and it's a currency mineral of the future, thinking about what is going to be the currency of the future. So I used 60 objects that circulated in informal economies and as a currency from the beginning of the human civilization till now, from shells to corn, beads, but also objects that circulated in prisons or schools or economies in crisis, like now in Ukraine or Poland during the martial law in the 80s. And I pulverized all these objects and created this new mineral. And the shapes are created by capture of opinion dynamics around 100 seismic events that happened over the past 20 years, which is since the beginning of social media, when history is also crowdsourced and millions of people participate in writing historic events. I think I'm going to stop here.
We have our own. Test. Okay. That looks like ours. Okay.
So I'm Erica Love.
And I'm João Enxuto, and we're collaborative artists.
So we'll try not to talk over one another.
Okay.
We'll see how we do. We're going to start with this film we made in 2016 called Institute for Southern Contemporary Art, or ISCA, and it highlights certain relevant themes in our recent work.
And we're showing you just stills of what is like a fairly complex film with a narrator, but we're showing this piece because it is built off of a proposition. And the work that we're showing you basically are propositions and prototypes of ideas that we think could help empower artists through new technologies. So the premise of this piece is that the Institute for Southern Contemporary Art, ISCA, is a potential institution that basically uses a predictive art market algorithm to basically help artists produce work that will maximize profits. And the purpose of maximizing profit is that then it produces a sort of endowment that creates a space where artists can then pursue alternatives to dynamics and quantitative criteria that's defined by the art market as we know it.
Right, so to do this work, you might recognize this as South Beach. We were teaching and making exhibitions in Miami and Atlanta. And the pitch for ISCA, which it kind of is constructed as a pitch, was this Art Institute ISCA would be in a repurposed Marcel Breuer's last built building that was at risk for demolition in Atlanta. So it was actually grounded in like a real concrete structure, but it was speculative in nature and was a proposal. And we were researching art market algorithms at the time. And to quote, we have a quote from there, from the essayistic film: "Art is produced as a commodity. It doesn't become one when it is sold." So it's the idea that market optimization isn't an end unto itself. It is to reroute capital to fund a think tank, as João had said, to find a meaningful alternative. So we wanted to support artists who had practices that were not remunerated by the art market. So this ISCA algorithm could predict works that would enter the market and fund this think tank. Here it is as a module, because it's can travel, this concept of this institute. And here is the algorithm calling data.
Yeah, that's our server room. And so ultimately, the principles that we wanted to work with and then led to our next body of work, which is a continuation, is that we like to think of art as an economic media, as Erica pointed out. We want to think about it, it's a derivative value, what emerges as value out of a work after it's produced, and how that value can be leveraged by artists throughout the lifetime of the work.
Which brings us to a trio of 3 prototype sculptures that we'll show you that relate directly to some of the things we'll be talking about today. They're encouraging greater mutuality between art producers and the custodians of artworks, which in most cases could be collectors or institutions collecting artworks. So this first one is called the Mining Museum, and it's a faceted steel enclosure created with a Miami-based design firm, Office GA, it was called at the time, by Jonathan Gonzalez, to invoke an architecture common to contemporary art institutions built during the global art market boom. You might recognize the millennial pink color, and it's domestically scaled for home or a gallery interior.
And just to clarify, this is one of 3 sculptures. These are enclosures. The interior has a pretty high-powered Ethereum mining rig, so it mines cryptocurrency. So the enclosure is one thing, but then what is inside is like a bit of a Trojan horse.
And with And then with this particular sculpture, the main point is it's built in, it's an experimental model anchored on the 1971 Robert Projansky and Seth Sieglob artist resale right contract. So attached to this sculpture is a smart contract. It mines Ethereum, so you could have a smart contract. And within that contract, it stipulates that there will be resale rights to the artists, and it will have to be within reason plugged in at the institution where it shows or at the collector's home or storage space. And the cryptocurrency, the Ethereum that is mined, will go to our wallet. So that derivative value of the piece through its duration of existence in order to exist will be captured by the artist. Because we were thinking often without resale rights or without a sort of configuration like this, derivative values often surpasses, it does not reach an artist typically. Should we go to the next? Yeah.
So we thought about what is an artist's labor? What do we do? Well, we speak on panels like this one. And this is called
Crypto Coffer.
The Crypto Coffer. And so we basically sourced a carry-on size Pelican case. We're able to fit a mining rig in it. So we only did this a couple times, but when we go to a gig, we would install this, and then it mines cryptocurrency at the host institution while we are doing a presentation.
So all we require is a power outlet and a consistent Wi-Fi connection. So we didn't bring it this today, and we'll talk about why we didn't. But yeah, normally we would, not normally, but on a couple of occasions we brought it, traveled internationally with it and plugged it in, and it was mining cryptocurrency while we were presenting.
And our final mining rig piece in this trio is a piece that was installed recently. It's called the Final Miner, because we wanted to kind of commemorate the important transition from proof of work to proof of stake, which was also known as the merge, which made Ethereum 95% more energy efficient. Ethereum is the cryptocurrency behind smart contracts, NFTs, and so incredibly relevant.
And for this piece, we installed it in August of 2022, so recently, but that merge happened on September 15th. So before that, this rig was mining proof of work, and then when it went to proof of stake, it just stopped. So it's the last in the trio, and the display, which streamed a sequence of mining hashes, has gone dark, and the black acrylic enclosure now serves as a casket, and it remains.
That's it.
We want to end on death.
Before we launch into the conversation, I wanted to give a little context about Rhizome. So Rhizome is a nonprofit digital arts organization. We're an affiliate of the New Museum, and since 1996, we've championed digital arts and culture. As we all know, digital culture changes daily, yet time and time again, artists are often the ones who reveal the potentials and really crucial breaking points of new technologies. Throughout its time, Rhizome has been crucial in major cultural moments, such as the minting of the first NFT in 2014 by Kevin McCoy and Anil Dash at our conference 7 on 7, where we pair artists with technologists and challenge them to create something new. And then coming up on December 10th at the New Museum, we're gonna be using our groundbreaking digital preservation tools to reanimate Cyber Powwow, which was one of the first major museum presentations. This launched in 1997 and was one of the first major online exhibitions, and it has not been exhibited at a major institution before. Cyber Powwow is described as an aboriginally determined territory in cyberspace. It was founded by the Nation to Nation Collective, composed of Sky Winati, Ryan Rice, and Eric Robertson. And this is a prime example of connectivity between artists and community, and it's paved the way for the topics that we're going to discuss in this conversation. To the left, you see Cyberfeminism Index, which is like a hypertext book and website that chronicles the topic of cyberfeminism, and that is just launched as well through Rhizome. And we cannot do that. Well, while that's up, thank you. So let's move on to the discussion. So João and Erica, given your topic and research, I wanted to start by talking about extractive capitalism in the art world. So like you said, your 2018 work, The Mining Museum, fuses Ethereum mining with the model of stakeholding derived from the artist resale royalties contract that Seth Sieglob and Robert Przyansky outlined in 1971. And ultimately this project kind of allows content producers to capture more value from their work in perpetuity. I was wondering if you all could actually talk a little bit more about extractive capitalism in the art world and as it relates to your current interests.
Well, maybe we can also do, with this question, which is a very good one, thank you. I think maybe a side question is, what is non-extractive capitalism? And I think non-extractive capitalism is probably regulated capitalism. And the Sieglob-Przyansky contract is an important historical marker in regulating or trying to intervene through contractual means, a way for artists to, in some way, profit from their work as it enters the market, the secondary market, whatever tertiary market may be. So I don't know how familiar folks are with it, but it's had varied success, but it's only been a couple of artists, a handful of artists who've been successfully able to insist and enforce it. But what blockchain opened up, and Ethereum specifically in the Spark contract, is that this could become packaged in the protocols of the work itself, so that the work is complete, or it's a portion of what constitutes the work, is this contract.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would say a bright spot with the NFT boom was that a lot of the platforms that were selling NFTs had a default function that would automatically declare resale rights for the artists selling their NFT on that particular platform. Now, of course, the problem becomes if they sell it on another, if it sells on another platform, that doesn't transfer over. But I think it was a bright spot in that it became a default, and a lot of artists now are talking more freely. Our digital artists and artists of all likes are talking about the need for resale rights. So I think it has been like a moment for it more recently.
Yeah, I maybe have a question for the two of you, because you've been involved in blockchain and Ethereum stuff since like long before I was, but I was kind of taken by surprise that royalties were built in by default to a lot of these platforms, right? Because if you're talking about a rising asset price, like a royalty, if it's like something like 5%, that's actually a lot of friction in the profit between selling and reselling the asset. So I wonder if you have thoughts about why so many people chose to do it. That strikes me as an anomaly in how we've seen most markets for art and NFTs and so on behave.
And you're saying a friction for collectors to not want to?
Well, I mean, imagine like investing in a speculative asset, and then you want to see it rise like 20%, or you want to see like a big peak in a valley and buy low, sell high. When there's a 5% royalty, that margin is reduced by 5%. So it seems like if you were trying to really concentrate or maximize the gains, then you would not include royalties as the default on the platform, which is what strikes me as such a unique thing about this space, that so many people chose to do it.
But it's the artists that are choosing that. Right.
Would not the competitive pressures of the market force the artists? I'm talking about in the aggregate. A lot of people just choose to drop the royalty because they're preventing their work from gaining speculative value.
If it were a rational market, maybe it would matter.
If it were a rational market.
I mean, what's the difference 5% here with the way it was going? I just don't. I think
5% is a normal day in crypto. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh God, only 5%.
Well, it was so unpredictable, the market at the time, and it still is, right? So is cryptocurrency. It fluctuates wildly. So to demand 5%, I think it kind of opened up that, insistence. Like, it's not a big deal to demand 5% when cryptocurrency could increase well over that within a short time span. So.
Yeah, I would also say that, like, that affordance becomes very, very simple. I mean, if you're going to bother to have a program or like build a smart contract, this is basically a few more lines of code. Especially if you're working from a template, I think it's the ease of it happening, right? Because the thing about the Perjancy-Siegelab contract is that it kind of came out of like conceptual work that that Siegelab was doing, like that came out of the Xerox show, where you would Xerox the contract. And then there was little perforations, and you would cut it out, and you would stick it on the back of your artwork physically, as if it would be.
You can still do that. You can print it out and download the PDF.
Yeah, but this thing of it being, and with a smart contract, it's simply baked into like the code. So one doesn't have to fuss with all the problems of like physical work, So.
But I also think like the NFT space, is. A lot of those people that are selling are more, maybe they identify more as digital artists. They might have done more work for hire as designers. So they're used to being paid probably more so than artists. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe, I don't want to, assume there's more self-respect or just what they're used to. Mm-hmm. But that's also, I think, what kind of influenced everyone asking for more, as they should.
Erica, pivoting off of that, I was thinking about how, like, in recent history, there's been, you know, a really huge shift in, I guess, like, the smaller and smaller things that are being, you know, tracked and commodified and turned into data. Like, I think it's kind of, at this point, maybe attention and affect and viewpoints that were expressed. And I know, Josh, like, in your work, you also think about, like, micro-communities, or I forget the term, etiology. And I was wondering if you can talk about the kind of, like, hyper-specificity of identity that you've observed and maybe participated in online, and I think, like, how that relates to, you know, like, collective intelligence, which is something that, like, Agnieszka also, you know, dabbles in.
Yeah. I guess as we've seen the platform bomb of these massive monopolistic Web 2 platforms just reduce all barriers to publishing, liquidate editorial, curatorial oversight, there's more content than ever, right? Every year there's more photographs produced than the totality of every year leading up to it. And the same goes for journalism, and you can see the pretty severe devaluation in that space, where in the I'm paraphrasing this from Carly Busta of the New Models podcast, but in the 1970s, in the major publications, journalists would get something like $10 a word, and in 2020, it's like 25 cents. So it's you know, it was declining before, but then platform publishing was like the nail in the coffin for a lot of different creative industries. So what you start to see in that space is that the scarce resource actually becomes attention, and the incentives, the indirect subsidization of advertising, leads people to create all of these inflammatory, sensationalist, divisive, lunatic conspiracies and things like this that, like, thrive in the environment of social media. So if you're talking about young people who are coming into a political identity during this period, where there is, like, I think a broadly agreed upon legitimate, real political crisis, but then there are also the intentionalist incentives of social media, people start to get really, really creative with it. And you begin to see that the images I showed earlier were flags designed by the users as they're kind of juxtaposing, jamming together different political ideologies to stake out a space which is, like, more or less their personal brand. In the early onset of social media, say like 2011 and 12, we saw a lot of things, the collision of hashtags through social media spaces like Tumblr, where you would get, like, Pale Goth and C-Punk and Witch House and stuff like that, this kind of counterintuitive pairing of different genres, and people are doing that same thing today with political ideologies. What starts to happen is that in the vast, enormous scale of the internet is that certain things thrive in a way that's, like, different than the legacy media model, where you might see a ratio of, like, 10 to 1 or 100 to 1, that things outperform each other. In the space of social media, given that scale of competition, it's like 1,000 to 1, millions to 1. And certain things that are, like, maybe fringe, little-known histories, things that are entirely made up, or just a bit of fiction that kind of catches in your political imagination, those things can thrive and be massively, massively amplified through this system. And it's kind of, it's all piggybacked on the, like, intentional incentives of the current social media design.
So I wanted to add on this question about new forms of extractivism and how these questions of value production in systems is very important for my work, because we have to really examine, especially with this extraction where the entire society essentially became a factory of data production and exploitation. I think that even when we are producing artworks or participating in the art market, we have to be aware of the complexity of, like, who is producing what value and where, and I think that you are also drawing on this in your work. So for me, it's very important, for example, like the images of the end of Signature, where I'm looking at all the people that are constituting a collective social capital of a work or of a project in science, or how many people are basically unrecognized, how many, like even art system is, to answer to what you were saying, Josh, about writing and writers, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, that essentially writers are the people that are legitimizing art, that are basically the art writers are the ones that have a huge impact on the shaping of the value of the artworks. And yet this is the group that is completely not remunerated, less and less, to the point of like a lot of writers just leaving the art field because it's not sustainable, at least in the United States, completely not sustainable. And so I've been experimenting a lot with like various forms of profit sharing, and I wanted to bring this up as a sort of strategy, and so for example, like the works that I was showing, conversions. So these paintings are actually assumed, they are referring to the question of abstraction in painting, but juxtaposed with abstraction in finance, and how it's obscuring, essentially, how it's turning workers into abstractions, and how digital capitalism made it even easier, that some ghost workers are turning into some kind of ghost in the machine, but in fact, what are they? They are like workers extracting coltan or copper or gold in mines in Africa or Asia, or these are internet users, voluntary and involuntary, that are either circulating images online or, for example, training AI algorithms. And I think that this becomes especially important when we're thinking about AI art, to understand that AI, what is AI essentially? I mean, it's a system of a global exploitation of global collective intelligence of involuntary participants who are using the internet, who are posting online or using the natural language models, posting anything. This is used to train the algorithms like GPT-3, and people posting images that is used to train machine vision algorithms. So essentially, this is AI. It's a collective intelligence. It's an exploitation of collective intelligence. So the works that I was showing before, but a lot of like other projects that I've been working on, are really addressing this question: where is the value produced, and how maybe we should find the ways to redistribute the capital that is generated in the art market? Because especially with digital, with NFTs, for example, a lot of capital is being generated, and how to redistribute it. So I've been trying to kind of incorporate this in the works themselves. So for example, the conversions paintings that I was showing earlier, a significant portion of the profits from these works are redistributed among social movements. I've also redistributed work among workers online, and I'm now planning to redistribute some of the proceeds among actually art writers, because precisely this is the whole constellation of people that are contributing to production of value.
Yeah, it sounds like you're causing like a sticking mechanism in the value circulation or like expansion at any means that happens a lot. And I think like when new technologies come up, whether it's like, the Web 1.0, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, I notice that there's often this rhetoric that kind of mirrors or aligns with like the old American logic of like manifest destiny and like expansion. And like in this context, I think like ecological impacts is kind of like a means to an end for like innovation or progress. And I think, there are climate implications, or like you're saying, like implications for workers. And I think for all of you, I'm just curious, like, how are you thinking about, the environment or climate and carbon impact, or like maybe the long-term impact of some of the technologies and ideas that you engage in your work?
I have quite a bit to say on this topic.
All right, let's go.
This is the book. Okay, so I showed this book before, Politogram in the Post-Left, and this plots the arc of radicalization of a group of teenagers who begin sometime around 2016 as lefties, social democrats, syndicalists, what have you, and then through the disappointments of the following years, around 2017-18, there's this massive arc of eventually resolving into eco-extremism, circulating the writings of active eco-terrorist groups, sending what used to be memes a few years ago, then turn into instructional diagrams for how to produce improvised explosive devices. It's a really radical onset of children who are, in many cases, too young to drive, right? This is what was happening online. The key factor in their radicalization was that climate change is, we are past so many benchmarks that there's not even a way to do carbon counting, carbon capture, solar radiation management, what have you, that the collapse is basically locked in and inevitable. And what that does to the political imagination of a teenager is that it drives you to some really, really radical places. Yeah, so I think about this a lot. I've dedicated a good portion of my life to this project now. I have made connections with radical young people and watched them transform over the few years of being involved in these spaces to a really, really extreme degree. These are like 24/7 chat rooms that just go all day. And a few of them I've done extensive podcasts with. I've co-published books with a few of the people in this space, so I know it quite well. I've invested a lot of time. They have found ways to live with their ideas, but they have not necessarily backed down from the doom and gloom. My ideas on this topic are that there's going to be some unavoidable, necessary technical solutions to the climate question, and that if this is a type of reliable, important political forecasting, then a burgeoning anti-tech sentiment is going to be popular dissent against some of the necessary solutions, right? So when we try to introduce the technologies which are going to require global cooperation, immensely complex, that in a majoritarian democracy, you are going to need to win the hearts and minds of many people in that society to be able to trust those who deploy this incredibly expensive, complex technology to serve the interests of most people. What we've seen in the past few years of this like early detection on social media through analyzing trends and through watching essentially mimetic activity, that a lot of these things begin in very fringe groups with really niche ideas and then are amplified massively and resonate with an enormous audience, right? We've probably seen, I can't not think about it because it's been all over Twitter, but Kanye West has made some quite outrageous headlines in the past 24 hours. Those were things that were discussed in very small pockets of the internet, specifically through niche content creators in the formats of podcasts, YouTube videos, well, they're not on YouTube anymore, live streams and so on. And I think that this kind of early detection work is actually really, really important. So if this research bodes as an indication of emergent trends that will soon be widely adopted, I think we're going to have a very difficult time deploying the necessary technologies to properly address climate change if we retain any sense of a functioning democracy. If you transition to a overnight radical authoritarian regime that decides to deploy these technologies without the consent of the people, then that may happen. We may be headed down that route. But yeah, I think climate is going to be the absolute most pressing question on the minds of young people in the very near future when it comes to politics.
So I think that's a very important question because this actually is questioned the whole ideology of individualism, which has to come to a stop. That this is the ideology that is part of capitalism from the beginning, and this is this ideology that brought us to species extinction, climate change, and radical social inequality and everything else. And so this is why we have to, these are the problems that we can only resolve through collective intelligence. And also the kind of carbon footprints that we are producing, they are collective carbon footprints, that everything happens in aggregate. And I think that this is why, like digital technologies and digital artworks can address it in various ways because they are precisely talking to this aggregation and having things that are a result of like a collective accumulated footprint from digital to carbon. And I've been trying to address this, but also to kind of to have to also think about maybe how artworks could change in the future and how they could maybe react to things that are happening in the outside world as things are changing. Because we're living in times where different kind of changes in the ecological systems, in social systems are happening so fast that we don't have time to process them and to develop methodologies, to develop toolkits to talk about it. So essentially, I started working with this, systems that create forms out of collective intelligence, but systems that also could produce artworks that could in the future also react to changes in society or changes in an ecological system. So something changes out there in the world, and something physically changes in the artwork, in the physical matter of the artwork, to kind of create this collective accumulated digital footprints. Because I feel that there are a lot of works, there's a lot of discourse about these questions, but it's not necessarily, it's just kind of illustrative. And I'm interested in really physically connecting, especially digital capitalism and geology and physicality of works. Also thinking about like how digital objects, kind of following this logic of Bernard Stiegler or Yuk Hui or Gilbert Simondon and many other thinkers that were talking about it, how we're living now in times where our digital devices, like our phones, they are objects that have a very different nature, because they can be not only changed by their creators, by the programmers, but they are also created, they are changed by crowds of users, misusers, and so maybe also forms of artworks could change in a way to have a dialogue with this, questions.
Yeah, João and Erica, do you have anything to add on about this?
I just briefly, and I think it relates. I guess a quick response I have is just to try to triangulate between these the points Josh and Agnieszka made, is that there's, besides this kind of like emerging like anti-tech, like Zoomer fringe ideology, we're also sort of dealing with the kind of like boomer and legacy, like anti-tech, anti-tech, but also like anti-rational. Like we've known for 50 years. The models have shown like where we're headed, right? But then there's also this like the social spaces that have been created out of the dirty carbon economy, and how those legacy like social spaces produce a politics which refuses like the rational model, the reality under which we're living, right? So there's that form of resistance as well from both ends. And so I think when we talk about collectivities or collective intelligence, there's also like the dark side of like the collectivity that we also like that also emerges within and outside of like certain ways that we model data. So these are very general statements, but I just wanted to like flag those 2 points, which I think are related.
We've got about 5 minutes before we move to question and answer. And so I think I'll ask one last question, which is just kind of shifting to like what keeps you all invested in making work? And like what are some of the ideas that you're investigating either through your own research or through that of your peers that you believe maybe would prompt like agentive ways of thinking about these topics, or even just futurity, or any of the kind of things that you find generative in your practice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that could be nice to end on a positive note to talk about that. I'm really interested in what you mentioned, Josh, and what your project. In a lot of ways, our projects were kind of speaking like or thinking of the role of artists, because that's what we identify as, and a lot of things that we've been thinking about more recently is this crossover between artists becoming activists, or can activists become artists? Because we saw recently how much attention, or you can see that this week at Art Basel, how much attention art gets. So how can activists deploy some of art strategies to get attention for their causes, and how can artists, make meaningful changes and become activists? And what is the difference between those sort of identities? So that's something that we're thinking about a lot for a film that we've been working on for a bit.
Yeah, because any art project requires funding and capital. We're also thinking about ways in which, and this follows with our previous work, is like what are the funding streams, or how are our artists supported versus how are activists supported, and how and where do those merge, where do those diverge? So those are kind of like general questions we're thinking about in terms of like producing new forms of solidarity, but also thinking about how, this is all infrastructural questions, right? Like where do you find your people? Where do you find your funding? And what are the distinctions ideologically, and what are the goals?
Right, and beyond just research, yes, we'd like to create some affinities and new forms of solidarity across these sort of groups.
So I'm thinking a lot about in which direction we are evolving as a species, and this kind of moments, especially moments created by technology that is now really accelerated, and it's very palpable to see some kind of change, both social and ecological, and of course there are a lot of absolutely horrifying things that are happening, but it's at the same time very interesting to be watching things happening so fast in so many realms and in societies and social movements. And so I'm thinking about how artworks, production of artworks will change in the future, and how maybe in, I don't know, 100 or a couple hundred years, this whole idea of like individual authorship will be replaced by some kind of more complex collective forms, also based on redistribution of capital, potentially, where artworks will not be even created only by multitudes of humans, but maybe also other organisms and non-humans and geological forms and algorithms. And I'm thinking about this kind of polyphonic creativity and plural subjectivity, because I think that this is the way to think about the future. This is the only way we can solve the problems, for example, of climate change, through this kind of plural subjectivity. And I'm also thinking in terms of these changes and shifts about how we're actually undergoing some kind of collective mutation or collective trauma and kind of plasticity of the collective social brain, which obviously is triggered by the pandemic, but also by wars, migrations, and how this, in a way, could be registered in the kind of stratification of artworks. So I'm working on a film that will be actually, the main character is animated by a crowd, and how this can change actually storytelling and cinema in the future.
Yeah, just briefly, because I know that we're winding on our time here, but on this question of what keeps you invested in it, I think we have a severe media problem in this country, and some of the narratives have not necessarily caught up to the way that culture is being produced and shaped at the moment, right? With the massive transition of culture and journalism being produced from, like, let's say 2010 to 2020, there's this gradation during that period where everything moves online, and it just determines the narratives that circulate throughout society. So in the formation of these political movements that collect online, they are littered, permeated with the aesthetics of internet culture. And I think this early detection work is actually, it's very necessary, because by the time that they make an impact, for example, say like the Boogaloo Boys from a few years past, that had been circulating on the internet for quite a long time. And I do this once a week. I talk to a journalist about some kind of emergent internet subculture, and they just need the background info on it, right? Part of the problem that we've seen that's very pronounced throughout American political discourse, but also everywhere else, is that the people who are tasked to write about these things just do not have the time to download the requisite years of immersion and experience in the space to give a meaningful summary of these movements when they are all of a sudden thrust into the national discourse on the public stage. So my solution for that is to, I'm the director and founder of an organization called Do Not Research, where we have a wide a group of artists contributing. João and Erica actually published a piece with us a few weeks back. And this internet culture research is a direct opportunity for artists to make a meaningful impact in the political discourse. And I would like to see a world in which if you were reading a bit of writing about some emergent phenomena online, that there should be some type of trustworthy name that you know is giving a non-biased analysis that is objective in the origins of these things. In many times we've seen media set the narrative where they actually seed contested symbols in this mimetic warfare to the worst actors in the space. And actually a lot of these intentional incentives drive people to do that. It drives clicks, it sells advertising, and you hand over a lot of power to the people that you're supposedly trying to fight against. These are media bubbles that keep blowing themselves, and there's a kind of oxygen of amplification which keeps them running. So my way of responding to this was actually to for a few years to really step away from art galleries, from museums, from institutions, and to publish on the platforms, to create a podcast, to run a Discord, to now facilitate, provision, to resource this blog, this organization of people, which is, let's say, like 1,500 community members, 150 people who have published to the blog, 200 plus posts in the past 2 years. That is really, really dense research of these emergent political factions, aesthetic movements, and things happening online. So yeah, and now we spend a lot of time talking with journalists and setting the proper narrative for how to interpret these things, and that is something that needs aesthetic expertise, and it needs the perspective of artists. So the degree to which it keeps cropping up and it becomes very visible in the media, if you try to step away from it, you can't, because it's such a pressing subject.
Thank you all for these really generative ideas and questions. I'd like to open it up to the audience, both here and online, for any other questions that you may have for the panelists. I believe there's a mic that will be passed around as well. We have one right here in the second row, and then one in the third row later.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. There's a lot to unpack here. I have a question that touches on so-called decentralization. How you talked about regulating capitalism, and I guess with the collapse of FTX recently, but other events, I've been thinking about the compatibility of democratic principles with that are enforced by government with the mechanisms of decentralization and what was meant to be made possible by Bitcoin. And thinking of that, going back to the cypherpunk and the idea that the question: do we really need mediums outside of state control? Do we build, and how can we build a system outside of state control? I've looked into various opinions and ideas, and it seems to me that at this point, 2022, opinions are divided between pro or contra that fundamental questions. And I'm wondering if any of you on the panel have, with an insight, with the experience we've been having this past 10 to 15 years, some good ideas, opinion, authors or artists to point out that can bring a forward perspective on that question of decentralization versus government control. And I'll stop with this, but I hope this is kind of understandable.
Can I jump in on that very briefly, because I'm sure João and Erica have a lot more to say on the subject, but I think there's a we should not conflate FTX and crypto and the potentials of decentralization, because FTX is a centralized exchange. And I think that what will happen in the crypto crash in the winter that is going to be unfolding in the next few years, very likely, is that speculation on the base currency was never the most interesting or largest potential of the Ethereum network, right? A stateless substrate upon which to coordinate things like carbon counting is a very compelling proposal. But I think in the winter, when we can remove all of this speculation, some of the most interesting things of like coordinating large communities, tokenizing communities, there's so much speculation in the space that it's like kind of hard to ignore. But the really interesting things are ways to coordinate online communities. So I think it'll be good if we see a little bit of the money drain, and then the people who build stuff are just really interested in new types of organization.
I agree.
Is there any?
I mean, just in terms of how like. The kind of the cypherpunk origin, or the kind of this the origins of crypto as like as a radical form of decentralization, but also like of cryptography as a form of becoming invisible and not being recognized by the state, or operating like in ways that cannot be tracked. Right. That's the fantasy of the trustless machine, the world computer, decentralization. But I think always the issue is always scale, and if like the tool or the platform can can actually be like implemented and have large enough of a what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, whether or not there are actually, if there's a it's not, we don't necessarily have a solution that's looking for a problem, right? Where we sort of need to then now operate in a way that's different than like these kind of like origin stories like that emerge from like the cypherpunks, because you know, there is no invisibility anymore. There's no way to kind of like escape data collection and aggregation, right? So I don't know what the answer is, but I think like smaller scale organizing is like where you begin. There's the model of the DAO. Those have been flawed also because of, I think, the influence of kind of like crypto speculation. But again, like we're maybe entering another period where experimentation actually would begin to bloom because there isn't that weight on these platforms.
So I wanted to add that, well, obviously this whole problem emerges in a landscape where in platform capitalism you have platforms that have a power comparable to entire states or bigger than many states. So this is already a very difficult landscape to operate in. And I kind of wanted to throw in there one of the alternative ideas that have been very inspiring for me in the recent years, which is the concept of lottocracy. So selection by lotto, by randomization, which is it sounds like a radical idea, but actually it's now being examined by a lot of political scientists that, you know, instead of, for example, in representation and parliamentary elections, where the only people that are candidates are members of political parties that, as we know, are very disproportionately representing people that most often come from some means, and people with like, you know, lower education levels or poor people are not represented. So these models is one of the new things that I've been researching in terms of steps to alternative forms of decentralization, going beyond the DAO and going beyond this incentive to not necessarily, I mean, yeah, to go back to some kind of forms of individualism again.
This is a fascinating ideology on its own, that representative democracy is so dysfunctional we should randomly select someone to go into government.
Well, I mean, or out of you know, candidates that are volunteers. But this idea.
I thought it was conscripted.
No.
I thought they were gonna.
No. Both ideas are being. No, this is not a joke. These are very serious like ideas
Is there
that
a
are being.
flag for this? Because I could.
I'm sure
I'm
you can
working
make
on
one. We had one question here on the third row. I think if that's, we still have. Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out what my question is. Well, so I wanted to ask about one thing I've noticed with NFT artists is that there seems to be a mashing up of different art worlds, right? You have the young artists that are coming in and not quite realizing that a lot of artists are not being paid, you know, and thus expecting them to, you know, to be paid. And I also feel like they are being exploited by the crypto people who, you know, need a handy use case for their crypto. Actually, I was just at a crypto conference here, and they were talking about how, you know, this art stuff was a fad. Those are the words that, you know, they're going to have to find another thing to use now that the fad is over. So it just makes me feel like the artists are being exploited in that way, and I wanted to know your thoughts on this exploitation or potential exploitation that's happening with NFT artists.
I think this also ties into what I was going to have be my wrap-up question, which is like how we can support you all as artists.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Artists are being exploited and the environment's being exploited as well, to tie into the theme here. Was there, your question was a comment on that, or, I mean, it's true. Yeah, I mean, it was just, the collectible market was what people were trading in, and art became another collectible, kind of a novelty trend or fad. That's definitely the case. I'm not going to stick up for it. I'm not, yes, I agree with what you're saying.
Well, of course, art is a currency, and we can, for example, see what happens in with artworks that are stored in free ports, that sometimes they are just used by drug cartels without even opening the crates to move money without physical money leaving the bank. And I also did meet here in Basel a number of people that are working in banking and are loaning money against art collections or individual artworks. So certainly art is an asset, is a currency, it's something disposable from that perspective, and it's obviously being exploited. But we have to also understand that this exploitation and this monetization is happening also to very intangible ideas that don't have a form, and discourse produced by artists that don't have to be physical artworks, and also to thinkers. I mean, basically anybody now present online can and is being exploited. So I think it's a broader process of just platform capitalism, exploiting absolutely everything and everyone.
On this question of NFTs in the art world being divergent to some degree, there's actually a great article about this very subject by Brian Droitcourt, who happens to be sitting in the audience with us. That's published on Outland. I forget the title of it off the top of my head, unfortunately, but it was a great piece. And I think in reference to artists being exploited, there are degrees of this. There is more and less exploitation, and the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. So we saw, I'm 35 now, I came into a creative career just as like the Web 2 platform bomb went off, and we saw a whole class of billionaires minted through this Web 2.0 platform capitalism that became immensely wealthy and then did not give back to society. They didn't make universities, they didn't make museums, they were not the Carnegies or the Fricks, and despite all of the baggage that comes with that history, they enriched themselves to their own gain and gave nothing back to anybody. They did not buy art, which is a very important distinction. And so I see now a whole new class of billionaires that's been minted in the last 3 years, well, maybe 75% down given the last few months, but they spent a lot of money on art, which is very peculiar because that had disappeared from American life. So we can debate whether the quality of that art was as good as what we see in the conventional art world. I happen to think that most of it is not. There are certainly standouts that are extraordinary NFTs, but on the whole, it's vastly less interesting than the art world. But it's very important that they did choose to spend money on art, and I think to try and shoehorn all of this into Michaela's last question is that part of my solutions for this, because now I have a community that is gathered around my syllabus and the podcast and all of this discursive element of the work, is that these kids are 19 and 20 years old, entering into creative life, trying to stake out a career, and the cost of living is so extraordinarily high in the States. There is so little of a safety net, and there are so little opportunities for remuneration to your work that we decided to start an institution and to fund those people's work by giving them grants, by facilitating their project, by paying contributor fees, by platforming people's work, by putting it into a show, publishing on the blog, publishing in a book that I think in a year's time they produced a 400-page book that we actually launched at the New Museum this summer. So yeah, I think when the market is not able to support opportunities for young artists, then we realize like why institutions existed in the first place. And that's yeah, that's what we find ourselves doing.
I'm sorry, I think we do have to wrap up. We're over time, but we can talk after. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for having us.